So thanks, Richard, for being here. And really interesting environment that WestJet has. And Richard's got some really interesting stories. And when you think about the airline industry and all of the changes and all of the moving parts, literally, it's quite fascinating. So thanks, Richard. Can we give him a warm BSides Calgary welcome?
Excellent. Well, thank you guys very much for coming today and giving me an opportunity to tell you a little bit about our WestJet story. But before I get started, BSide volunteers, raise your hand. Okay, big round of applause for these guys. These guys are doing an awesome job. Conference is going really well, and just really pleased, even from a speaker perspective. It feels like I'm at a top-notch conference, so you guys are doing a great job. Excellent job. So as I said, my name is Richard Sillito, and I'm from WestJet. If you're looking to get in contact with me, LinkedIn is probably the best place. I do have a Twitter account at Dorio. One day I'm going to get good at tweeting, but that won't be today, but hopefully soon. And for those of you who are wondering, my wife is from Africa, and she speaks Gujarati, and Dorio is white guy in Gujarati, so whenever I've done something bad, that's the name that comes out. Okay, so I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey today, and I'll give you just a bit of quick, brief history of how I ended up here. I have many certifications in IT, security information. I have my GSEC and my GPAN and my incident handler. And in that journey, I got to a point where I was doing pen testing against our own network. And I started realizing when I was pen testing against the network that a lot of the attacks that I was successful doing resulted in connectivity that didn't need to be there. And that got me thinking about how we segment our networks. And are we truly doing the best job at segmenting our networks? And I started getting kind of obsessed about segmentation and really starting to think about it. And it led me into developing a model that I called SAM, Security Architecture Made Simple. You're only going to see a piece of it, which is infrastructure, which focuses on the network segmentation perspective. But the interesting part of the journey was through that process, I came up with a simpler way to segment the data center, simpler from a firewall administrative perspective. And then that led me into a journey at looking at software-defined networking and virtualized network security, which led me into a journey at looking at automation. And I went, holy wow, I just figured out the end goal that business needs in this journey and what it is that I can deliver to business rather than just trying to be a lazy firewall administrator. And I love that. I have a saying, I find the line between laziness and efficiency. I live right on that line. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of where I'm heading, but I want to start this presentation off with this picture. Anybody know what this picture is? The channel. Well done, yes, exactly. This is when Philip Cosette and Graham Fogg met, and it was the two teams that dug a tunnel together, and that was back in 1990. I actually remember that moment. That's how old I am. But it was a real engineering feat, and it was totally intentional, extremely well planned that these two teams would meet right under the ocean and be able to meet at the exact same spot. Interesting little side story, that hole was not the first hole. If you look right between their two heads, there's a small 2-inch hole. It's called the pilot hole. That was actually the first hole that punched through. They punched that one through as the media event, but they actually knew they were there. But that just shows two teams extraordinarily working together. And then we get development and operations. The good news is they're close. They're not that far away. And I think development and operations probably aren't as far away as they think they are. And really when I look at it, the thing that doesn't quite get them to line up is really boils down to two elements. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the presentation. And that's on the development side. Do we have any developers here? Oh, awesome. Good. So you can tell me if I hit the mark. On the development side, there's always this feeling like anything can be solved with a line of code, right? So if we screwed up on the API, no big deal. We create another version, we access a new version, and we can slowly evolve and everything's fine. Infrastructure doesn't change like that. Infrastructure is like the Titanic. You throw the rudder and you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and eventually it starts to change. So that's kind of when you're looking at things from the development perspective. When you're looking at things from the infrastructure perspective, there's this belief that we can't apply code to make changes because it's just too scary. And that's the one thing that the developers have figured out. They've figured out, how do I write code? How do I make unit tests? How do I make things easily back-outable? How do I recover? And that kind of thinking is what we need to start aligning to on the operations side. And really, if we start looking at this farther, as far away as we can, and start to align those two philosophies, then when we get to this point, the bridge will actually touch, and we won't be so far off. So have a think about that as we go through the presentation. Kind of keep it in the back of your mind. So the agenda today, I'm going to talk about the problem. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? I'm going to talk about it from a network perspective and from a business perspective, so that you get both of the perspectives. We'll talk about a solution. I'm going to give a demo to show you how we apply some of these principles, and summarize it up and give you guys an opportunity for questions. That said, if you want to stop me at any point and ask questions, please do. Feel free. Okay, so let's talk about the problem. So when we look at the problem from the business perspective, and that's always where I like to start, what can we deliver to business that they want so that I can get what I want, right? And agility is really what businesses are driving towards. But when we talk, we throw around the word agility, and we talk about it like it's a process, or we talk about it, it's like it's an end state, but it's really not. It's a process. It's a philosophy. It's a way of doing things. So you have to think about how are you going to get to that agile state. So for me, this is how I mapped it out. Agility has to start with automation. So you can't be agile if everything's going to be manual. So operations guys, we need to give up the CLI. It's going to hurt, it's going to be painful, but we need to give it up. So we need to get towards automation. Automation's not possible unless we have orchestration, because, especially in operations, because the flow of steps is so critically important. The network has to be configured before the firewall can have the rule and whatnot, right? There's steps, so you need to have that orchestration. You can't have that orchestration without programmability. So you need the ability to have all your components be programmable so that you can have that automation and orchestration. And in most presentations, this is where it stops. Like when you talk to the vendors, this is where it stops. The problem is, and operations people will tell you that, they'll say, the world's not that simple. And that's the last step, is you need to figure out how can you make your world more simple so that you can make it programmable, so you can have orchestration, automation, and eventually reach agility. So that's the problem from the business perspective, working its way down to our world. So now let's take a look at it from the bottom up and take a look at, well, where does this complexity come from? Is the complexity of value, and how could we solve it if there is no value there? So what I'm going to use is network segmentation as just an example of that. There are many areas that you could apply this to, right? So like I said, I got a little obsessed with network segmentation, and I started, when I did, the first thing I did was start to ask myself the question, the network is complicated, but is it complicated for a good reason? Like, is it actually adding value? Are we actually creating a secure environment with this complexity? So I'm going to do a quick review of how we got where we got here today, right? Because some of you guys are young, some of you guys are old like me, and have lots of history, but some of you not so much, right? So we actually started with just a data center, right? And we threw some servers in there, we had mainframes, and put some information systems inside there. And then we got some users, and we called them trusted users. I think we've all kind of realized that term's so abused and doesn't really exist, but we'll use it in this context because that's what we did. So then we got some users, and we gave them access to those systems. And life was pretty good. It was relatively contained. And then along came the internet. Yes, there was life before the internet. So, and then the employees and contractors, people who we called trusted workers, they needed access to that internet. They needed to be able to get that information. Of course, bad things started happening. So we put in a firewall, because a firewall was going to solve all the problems, right? And then once users started accessing those services, we wanted to put services on the internet, right? Once we realized the value of that, and then we allowed people access to those internal services through that firewall. And well, that model didn't really work out, did it? I mean, there was lots of issues, we had lots of security concerns. So if one firewall wasn't enough, then the answer is really simple. It must be two firewalls, must be our answer, right? Yeah. So we created this concept called the DMZ, and we created this hop into our internal network, and life was all going to be good. Now, of course, we still had these trusted users with this hyperconnectivity inside the data center, still accessing and bringing in vulnerabilities. This model didn't work, right? Well, if two firewalls didn't work, what do you think our answer is going to be? Oh yeah, let's add another firewall. So we created this idea of a secured internal system, and introduced yet another firewall. Still the same problem occurs. We have hyperconnectivity between these trusted users in the data center. That leads to account credential leakage, which eventually leads to using the accounts valid accounts to go log into these secured internal systems, and again the compromise occurs. And this ties in with what Chris was talking about today, and that it's so easy to break into these networks and so hard for the detection guys to detect it, because we built it in a way that is going to make their job really difficult. So it's easier for the attacker and harder for the defenders. So I think at this point we can kind of agree. I mean, it's a sad reality, but I went, gee, everything I was taught about network security, really, it doesn't work, right? So what I did is I said, let's wipe the slate clean, and let's just start with a brand new data center. And if I could wipe the slate clean, how would I build that data center? So I would start with the data center being the only trusted place, because for the most part, that's working for businesses. From our pen testers, they rarely get to the data center. Never mind get in it. They report back to us that about 75% of IT people don't actually know where the data center is. So they went, it's really hard to find your data center. So starting with the data center being a trusted location is a really good place to start. Then what we want to do is break the data center up into, I don't want to say zones, I want to say loosely coupled services. So we're going to break them up into services, and we're going to categorize the services, but not segment them based on those categories, but just have them. And this is really there to help the detection guys to be able to categorize traffic. Now, every segmentation model, and I looked at a bunch of them, and I looked at data classification, I looked at compliance zoning, and all of that had really horrible firewall rule sets. When I started breaking it down by services, it got much simpler. But there was always one group who just blew everything up, and that was IT. Because IT does need this hyperconnectivity. So what I realized is IT needs to come inside the data center. It needs to have a virtualized environment inside the data center, and it needs to be treated differently. So in this model, you give IT unfettered access into that data center. Let them get their job done, but provide them with a secure area. That means limited. First, they jump in, so they have to. So it's a very thin. They have a word for that, the eyes gate, right? So an eyes gate in, a very thin access in, and then once you're in there, you have limited access to the internet, no email, no removable media. So you give them a safe place to work. If you can squeeze it in two-factor authentication, then you know who they are, right? But give them unfettered access into the data center. Then put a firewall on that. And then take all the users and put them on the outside. So now instead of trying to fight a war on two sides, one on the internet and one on the internal users, you fight a war on one side. Didn't work for the Germans, probably won't work for us, right? So put all the mud on the outside, and then let them access all their internet content outside of your network. So now you're keeping all that bad traffic outside of your network and keeping only that which is needed for business inside your network. And the beauty of this, when I looked at this model, is I just gave the business BYOD. And there's evolutionary steps. I'm not going to go into them, but there's evolutionary steps that you can do to get towards this. So if you're interested, let me know, and we can have a side conversation. So then when the users actually decide to actually do some work, they're going to come into the data center, but they're going to come in a consistent way, that they're coming through secured gateway services, and that creates a safe environment. So when we look at that model, that's a whole lot easier than our previous model, and it works. The security actually works. So I'm going to now dive down into, I gave you those 3 different areas inside the data center. I'm going to dive down into those areas and show you how I build those. So I use an approach called service-oriented segmentation, which I love the acronym, SOS, our call for help. So the idea is to break your data center up into service, we call them bubbles, service bubbles, and create a security context around those bubbles. So for example, I would take Mail Gateway and wrap that in a bubble. I would take something like Citrix and bind the NetScaler and the Zen app and the Zen desktop and everything and put that into a bubble. And then when you're doing this, what you do is you create a single firewall rule that says, I have this service, and anyone can access this service as long as they do it on the proper ports. Okay? And then I do the same thing for internet data services, like for API gateway and whatnot. So I'm building this with these very simple firewall rule set now that just says anything can talk to me as long as you talk to me on the ports that you're intended to talk to me on. Okay, I repeat the same exercise for the applications and then for the back-end services. So you just keep repeating that service or that process. Then what you do is you put the firewall in place and you put users on the outside of the firewall. So you're still maintaining that perimeter security around the data center. But inside the data center, what you basically have is a whole bunch of little firewalls, one in front of each service. And what you've done now is you've created little secured services within the data center that you can now tell the business, if you need to connect components, go ahead and connect them, because you've got them loosely coupled inside your data center. So if all of a sudden you want to have ERP send emails, that's fine. Why? Because you set up an email service with security around that email service that's appropriate for sending emails. So let the connectivity happen. So now all of a sudden we're giving the agility to business for them to be able to put components together and develop solutions. And then IT, when IT comes in, they come in through that component, through the regular access, just like any other user would come in. They would jump over to the IT admin area, and then use their tools and have that unfettered access into the data center. So that's kind of it, breaking it down from a component level. Okay, so like I told you, when I started looking at the network segmentation, I originally started looking at using Big Iron. I was going to put basically like an internet provider grade firewall in the center of the data center and then create these security bubbles around it. It was very costly, and what I realized is that was really good to do the segmentation, but if I wanted to add any other services, then to be able to route traffic to other security devices in that model was problematic. So we started looking at software-defined networking and virtual network and security, and that solves a whole bunch of problems. And I'm not going to go deep down into it. Grab me if you want afterwards, and I can go into more detail. But I will give you a little bit of a breakdown on it. So basically, if you look at it, we have a firewall in this model where we have this bubble approach. You have a firewall in the center with all these security bubbles. When we do virtualized network and security, what we're doing is we're taking that model and we're basically imprinting it on a host, so a hypervisor host. And then because the host has the virtual networking and security components inside of it to be able to enforce those policies. So then I can take that same model and I can just keep stamping it out on every host. So every host intrinsically knows the policies that it needs to apply. And then the real magic of it is the overlay networking, which really ties all those hosts together and makes it look like one solution. Okay, and that's kind of the 30-second on that. And then you just add a perimeter firewall, and you've got the solution. That's kind of the quick 2-minute on it. Like I said, grab me if you want more details on that. So let's take a look at applying the solution. Now, there's a couple things I want to cover off before I go into the demo, just to give you some understanding. Just a little sketch I made up just to help companies understand where the boundaries are between your cloud services, whether it be on-prem, IaaS, SaaS, PaaS, and where your responsibilities lay. And really, when you look at cloud services, you're always going to be responsible for governance. You're always going to be responsible for policies. So I'm coming in from the top there. And I'm not going to go through this whole slide, just the parts that are relevant. So policy is very important. And the idea is you want to have a policy engine. You want to have something that allows you to express the policies that you want to apply, the security policies that you want to apply. And they don't have to be security policies. They could be storage policies, network policies, whatever policy, right? You've always got to be able to express these policies. So you want to be able to express them, but you're going to need to separate that policy and the control point. So because as we move into more hybrid cloud solution, where we're having to distribute that security policy to many different types of technologies, we're going to need that ability to be able to take the policy and translate it down and have it applied as a set of controls. So in today's when I do the demo, you're going to see I'll highlight to you when I'm dealing with things at the policy level and when I'm dealing with them down at the control level. The tools that I'm going to use are all VMware tools that you're going to see today, but please don't consider that a vendor pitch by any means, although the VMware guy is in the room, so I have to be a little careful about how I say that. You can wave, Jeff. But they're all VMware products, but they're just because it's what I owned and what I had available to me to do this kind of this exercise. And but there are other tools out there, like OpenStack has this kind of stuff. Even Cisco has policy enforcement engines and distribution of that. So don't feel like that's the only tool. So the big tool that I'm going to be taking you through today is Service Composer, and Service Composer is going to be the policy enforcement point. And a couple things to understand about Service Composer is that, one, it's hierarchical in nature, so you'll see that as we go through the presentation. So I can create different levels and apply policy at different levels. And the second is that it allows me to look at the data center in multiple different what we call views. So I'm not implementing it in this demo, but it allows me to take a look at the data center from a compliance perspective and take a look at the data center from a operational perspective as well. Any questions before I start the demo? Okay, good. They're all just saying, "Shut up, Richard," so we can see the demo. I am going to do a live demo. I've sacrificed the appropriate gifts for the gods. Okay, so the first part of this demo that I'm going to run is creating a software-defined network environment for us to be able to operate in. And this really shows the power of virtualized network and security, because if I came to you and said, hey, I've got a brand new firewall administrator and I need an environment for this guy to go into and practice creating rules and practice setting up policy. Think about the incredible amount of effort that would be. You'd have to go pull out, the spare firewall, and you'd have to hook up a switch and go down into the lab and wire everything up for him, and then, give him a console, and of course things wouldn't work, and it would be frustrating for the guy. And so imagine if you could do this. So what I've got here is there's some connectors. By the way, there's a web front end for all this that's really pretty and everything, but I thought you guys would like to get a little bit farther under the hood, so we went down to the little lower level. You can see here that I've got some connectors and that's what's going to call the APIs to do the work. And then underneath that, you can see I'm giving a name to my software-defined data center that I'm going to be building. And I've broken it down to start off with in just two areas: infrastructure for infrastructure administrator and provider for provider administration. Just showing that I can have a couple of different layers in there. So I'm going to kick that off. Pray to the gods. So now it's running through this script and it's calling a bunch of APIs to get the work done. So now I'm going to switch over. So that was the automation and orchestration component. Now I'm switching over to the policy engine. And you can see that I now have a whole software-defined data center environment in there. So if I go in there, you can see I have my infrastructure and provider administration. You can see that I have some base set of policies in there that allow the administration to occur. So I've now created an environment and did that literally within seconds. So I could give this now to that security administrator and say, go ahead and play in there. So now let's add some more stuff to that, because a cloud is not a lot of fun unless you have some tenants. So here I'm just, I've got the same connectors. I'm going to select the provider that I want to put that tenant service under. We'll call this Chris in honor of our keynote today. So he'll be our first tenant. So, and then I'm giving some environments to the tenant. So I'm saying, I'm going to give you a prep area, I'm going to give you an administration area, I'm going to give you production, staging. And then within each of those areas, I'm going to give them, or within each of those environments, I'm going to give them some areas. So I'm going to allow them to have a gateway services, application services, and backend, just like I showed you. So we'll submit that. So you can see it's going through and creating the environments and the appropriate areas on the environments, and now it's completed. So going back to Service Composer, which is our policy engine. Now if I go inside that provider area, we're going to see that we now have a tenant called Chris under that provider area. Chris now has a prod environment, and he has gateway services, application services, appropriate policies are put on there. Okay, so the last step I'm going to show you, well, second last step, but last building step is let's add a service within there. And this is really where it comes back to that simplicity. If you think about how most of us are maintaining our firewalls today, you know, we've got source, it's you know, this IP to this IP on this port, and the incredible amount of complexity that it takes to figure out how to inject that rule into the rule set. Because you're making decisions like, does this ride on this common rule? Do I need to make a new rule? What is the ordering? You know, is this going to affect the ordering? Am I shadowing a rule? Those kind of things come into play when we do that really overly granular firewall rules. Once we simplify things and break this down into services, all of a sudden we can inject a rule into this rule set very easily, and I'll demonstrate that right now. So I've got those connectors. I'm going to put this into my provider, and yeah, I think that's right. No, that's not populating for some reason. Oh, there. Sorry, I just didn't pick the right tenant. So I've got my Chris tenant, and it's in a production environment. We'll create a gateway service. So we'll call the service email, and it'll be emails provided on port 25. So that's going to kick off some API calls. And when I get back to here, I'll do a refresh. And now we can see when I go into the gateway services, I now have an email service. And when I look at that, boom, it's got the email policy already applied to it. So you see, by simplifying how we do the segmentation, we now have the ability to be able to do things programmatically. So the last, any questions before I just, oh, actually, no, sorry. There was one last thing I want to show you. Okay, so I did all of that at the policy level. Everyone's cool on that? So I told you that we need to separate that policy and the control level. Okay, now because this is all VMware, this all happens inside an appliance called NSX Manager. But we will be integrating Palo Alto into this equation as well. So, and there's nothing that stops us from pulling all this information that we now have stored in this policy engine out and using that to call Palo Alto's APIs. That's one of the things we're working on, calling Palo Alto's APIs to be able to, again, program that policy into another different firewall. There would be nothing that stops you from calling Amazon's APIs and whoever's APIs you want. Once you have that policy defined and it's reasonably simple, you can express that policy in other places. So this, now you're actually looking at the firewall rule set. So this is the actual firewall rule set that would get pushed down to the individual hosts within the virtualized environment. And this would be applying that policy. So these are the three policies that we've applied in this demonstration. The rest is just stuff that's there from my lab. So, cool. Any questions?
What basic requirements are you using when you create your overarching bubbles of services? What are your criteria for those bubbles?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And because we have this really brilliant enterprise architect, and what was really cool was he came to my desk one time and he said that exact same question. He said, "How did you figure that out?" And I said to him, I go, "Why are you interested?" was the first thing. Like, you're the enterprise architect. And he goes, "I looked over your bubble diagram," and he goes, "It's not perfect, but that's the best representation of services that we have in our company." And I went, "Ooh, I must be onto something." And so he asked me, he goes, "How do you tell?" And I went, it's kind of hard. The best explanation for him is I told him, I said, I let the network tell me. Because when I take a look at things from a network perspective, what I tend to look for is if I have a group of servers and I send a single request in and it bounces around with and hits a bunch of servers and then has a little transaction come out, that's usually when I found a service. So a good example of that is our check-in service. It was so concise. It was obvious when we took it. We grouped the servers, then we looked at the network traffic, and it was obvious. There was like an 8443 call in. It bounced around like crazy. It did one call, 443 call out to Sabre, to update Sabre, who's the reservation engine, and then came back and then gave one packet back out to the user. And that's what told us, okay, that's a service. So we let the network tell us what the service is. And like I said, the creepy part was that the enterprise architect went, "You're right." Yeah, now you get into this argument, and it's an interesting one because people will go, you get into these discussions about, is it perfect, right? And it's not perfect. But the problem is, I say humans were great at identifying risk. We just suck at evaluating it. And we tend to accept things that today are very insecure and very risky just because we've lived with them for so long. So I had one person come and say, well, aren't you overgeneralizing the risk? And I went, okay, I said, we have 2,500 servers in our environment, of which 30% are behind firewalls. So that gives you 1,700 servers. We have 3,000 desktops. And those 3,000 desktops have unfettered access to those 1,700 servers. I go, let's make a random guess that there's about 10 ports per entity that are open. I said, go home and do the math on 4,700 endpoints with 10 different ports open and give me back the combinations and permutations of connectivity. And she looked at me and she goes, I'm going to have to put my calculator in scientific mode. I went, you're absolutely right. But when we look at this from a service perspective, what we do is we say, if we break our data center up into services, we're not finished the exercise, but the number that we're kind of sticking around is about 100 services. On average, those services have about 2 to 3 ports open. So when I said to her, go home, take 100 services, 2 to 3 ports per, now figure out what the combinations and permutations are. And she goes, it's going to be a lot smaller. And that's exactly it. So we need to be careful when you do this, not to scare yourself out of making significant progress. So there is that element of that. That's a very long-winded answer, but there are times when risk does take precedence, and actually compliance is where it really nabbed us. So we do have this concept, I don't teach it in this, but we have this concept of a sub-bubble. And so if you want to take it offline later, I can tell you more about a sub-bubble. It's a way to further break down the bubble but maintain the service aspect of it.
I was going to ask you to give me a sense of scale, but I think you just did on the number of servers and all that stuff. So just to follow up to that question, it was, you said things come in, they bounce around a bunch of stuff, and they come out, and that's how you get to your nice and easy bubble, which is great, and then you get these 1 or 2 ports that come out. But what I imagine is when you define that all that bouncing around is a little bit of Venn diagrams on your bubbles on shared. So all that bouncing around between services uses similar things. So do you then break those up and just make virtual instances of them in the bubbles?
No, we just say that that's a security bubble, and we accept that, because if you don't want to try and drive too far into that bubble, because if you want to, the easiest way I have to explain it to people when I don't have a lot of time is I say that the DMZ works, but we've overused the DMZ. We put so many services in there, there's now lateral shift within DMZs that creates problems. I go, basically what you're doing is you're taking your data center and you're giving every service its own DMZ. So in some respects, you don't want to worry too much about it. You want to put the security around that and your detection mechanism around it and let that entity exist. Now, that said, what you want to do is after you've done it all, then what you want to do is go through bubble to bubble and say, is what I put in place sufficient for that service? And if it isn't, then you want to drive down to either sub-bubble. Thanks. You want to either drive down to sub-bubble or put other protection mechanisms in place. But the one thing I always give as a caution is, as security practitioners, we try and make the firewall be the hammer that hits everything. And it doesn't have to be. We've got other methods. And if you've got a good segmentation strategy to come from, then you can easily layer on these other technologies. Did that answer your question?
No, it kind of happens, but not entirely. So what I imagine is, if I have, let's say, three different services, they're all going to use DNS. So in the way I'm just understanding, you're drawing a bit of a bubble around the service, but I think there's going to be a common DNS service, for example.
Oh, yes.
So it doesn't belong in any one service bubble, or do you replicate it so you can put it in a service bubble and sort of a little...
Yes. How I always, you separate it out into a separate bubble. And how I always, how I explain this to architects that are dealing with this is I go, think of it like gravitational forces. So tightly coupled components suck things into a bubble. Reusable components pull them back out. So that's the philosophy that I use. So if you see a reusable component that many things are using, that's probably something you need to pull out of that bubble. But if it's a tightly coupled, even if it's tightly coupled, you still want to pull it out. But if it's tightly coupled and not reusable, then it belongs inside that bubble. Okay? Good. Go ahead.
You were saying in this scenario, IT administration, they're on virtualized computers and they don't have any access to the internet.
Oh, sorry, I hope I didn't say no access. Highly limited access to the internet. We do recognize patching.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I have one other question. Your model, I guess, if you call it that, seems a lot like Google's Beyond Corp's Trust No Network, and I'm just wondering if you've been able to read into that and what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, there's, I think they call it no trust. Yeah.
Trust No Network or something.
Yeah.
Called
Yeah.
Beyond-
And
Beyond Corp's model.
there's also elements of zero trust in there. And actually, I had the opportunity to sit down with John Kindervog and talk to him. Gartner or Forrester actually wrote a white paper on us. You can go look it up. Yeah, there's very strong similarities to those, and I think those guys are totally right. Yeah, yeah, I think they're definitely on the right track. And I liked Google's approach, although I see it somewhat as an interim step, in that they have this concept of elevated access dependent on devices. And I think what we need to get to in the end is every device is untrusted. That's just too much utopia right now. So I like what they've done to analyze the connectivity and say, can we elevate this person's access because the vector they're coming in from is not threat representative. So I do like both those models. Yeah.
So my understanding so far, you're kind of using a perimeter firewall and yet a bunch of host firewalls to do whatever you want to do, right? So what are the challenges? You know, it seems like all of a sudden you have not just one firewall, you have multiple firewall. So it makes the administrator difficult to understand the whole thing. You know, in security, you don't understand, you cannot secure, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you manage all these, you know, all of a sudden all this big increase in terms of policy everywhere?
Yes. It's been a 2.5-year journey. 9 months of it was technology. The rest was people. and it really breaks down into two different things. One is the first step is you've got to get them to understand that you need to separate policy and control. That's extremely important in the exercise. The second one is you have to convince them that what they're doing today for network security isn't working. And those are two very hard tasks. Once you get past that, then you kind of got to put them on the ledge and really scare them and then talk them off. And then once you get past that, they actually adopt it quite easily. And especially once they see the firewall, how simple it is to administer. So you just have a list of service rules and you go, oh, this service has a new port, just add that port in.
So do you have like using a tool, kind of like a very high level tool, is able to pull the perimeter firewall and many different kind of firewall together and then kind of give the administrator a big picture of what's going on?
Well, that will be Service Composer in the end. Right now, we're doing manual syncing with the Palo Alto, just because we haven't built the interface yet. But once that's in place, Service Composer will be the place. So they'll literally just go to here to define all policy.
And the reason I asked you because you know, kind of like this, but not as sophisticated as yours, right? So we have perimeter firewall, we have host firewall, we have firewall here and there, and from one end to another, the traffic packet could have to go through four, five layer firewalls, and getting troubleshooting is a nightmare. Especially some firewall is managed by security groups, some is by network groups, and some is by the server guys.
Yeah, and one of the places you really have to talk the security people off the ledge is when you say we're going to collapse the DMZ. We're actually going to pull the DMZ back into the data center, and we're going to create like all these separate DMZs. The beauty of that is if you look at a lot of that complexity, a lot of the complexity of multiple firewalls goes away once you do that. Because now you're just saying, well, I have this environment and it's properly segmented and it's consistently segmented. It doesn't matter whether it's a DMZ or an internal service. So that simplifies that. One of the things that helps in that discussion is once you start taking the security practitioners and saying, okay, let's talk about how you're going to implement this in Amazon. Because Amazon's not going to give you separate servers in the DMZ with a separate physical firewall and all that. No, you're going to create virtual DMZs in their infrastructure. So really what you're trying to do is get them to realize you can do that same thing on-prem or off-prem. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Good. Okay, I'm going to show you one more thing. Hopefully I can squeeze it in before I get kicked off the stage here. And this is, this one last script that I'm going to run is actually going to clean everything up that we've done. And if there's any advice that I give to the people pushing DevOps is operations gets really scared when you tell them that we're going to create scripts that are going to build stuff. Because what they're worried about is you're going to build all this stuff and it's never going to go away. Why? Because that is their world. Nothing ever goes away. It lives and it's a pain in the ass forever, right? So whenever you write a script to build something, always write a script to destroy it. And that way you can show that to the operations guys and say, hey, look, we can remove anything we build. And that's exactly what this script does here. So it's just going to tear away and it's going to blow away that whole environment. So our firewall administrator that we gave that environment to, I can now, he came to me, he said, it's done, I can run the script, boom, it's all gone, and the firewall policy engine is back to its original state. Cool. Do we cut it now?